We begin now at the top of Daf Beis Amud Aleph Meseches Horayos. This is Horayos Daf Tube. The Mishnah says, Horu Bezdin lavor al achas mikol mitzvos ha'amuros b'Torah. If Bezdin issues a ruling to transgress any of the mitzvos that are said in the Torah, v'holach hayochid, and an individual goes v'osa shogeg al piem, and he acts in accordance with their ruling by mistake, bein sha'asu v'osa imoin, whether they did it and he did it with them, bein sha'asu v'osa acharein, whether they did it and he did it after them, bein shaloasu, whether they didn't do it, v'osa, and he did it, Potter, he is exempt in that case, because what he is doing, he is just relying on Bezdin. Essentially, it was the Bezdin's faulty ruling. And the Mishnah continues, Horu Bezdin v'yada echad mehen shato. Let's say Bezdin issued a ruling, and one of them realizes that it was a mistake. O Talmud, or let's say it's a student, v'hu roi l'hora, and he's fit to issue rulings himself. V'halach v'yasa al pian, and then he goes ahead and he does according to their mistaken ruling. Bein sha'asu v'asa imoin, whether they did it and he did it with them. Bein sha'asu v'asa acharein, whether they did it and he did it after them. Bein shalo asu v'asa, whether they didn't do it and he did. Hareza chayiv, in that case he is chayiv. Mimnei shalo talab bezdin, because what he was doing was not dependent upon bezdin. Zeh klal, this is the rule. Hatola biatzmo chayiv, if what he's doing on his own, then he's chayiv. V'hatola bebezdin potter, but if what he's doing is dependent on the bezdin, then he is potter, he is exempt. And Rashi explains, Horu Bezdin, if the Bezdin issues a ruling, and we will point out over here that generally when Bezdin is mentioned in this Masechet, it's referring to the Sanhedrin. And Rashi says, Kagon Shahoru Shachelev O Dam Mutter, for example, they issue a ruling that Chelev or Dam, blood, is Mutter, really Chelev, which is non-kosher fat, and Dam, which is blood, those are really Usr. They are forbidden, but the Bezdin issues a mistaken ruling that they are permitted. And we will also note that the mistaken ruling over here concerns something where if you do it b'meizid, you're going to be chayiv kares. Then an individual goes ahead and he acts in accordance with their ruling by mistake. Mefarish b'gemara. The Gemara is going to explain what exactly we mean that he's following their ruling and then adding the word b'shogeg by mistake. Bein sha'asu bezdin, whether they acted upon their ruling, v'asa hayachid imoim, and then the individual, he did it together with them. Kagon sha'achal dam ochelav imoin. For example, he ate the blood or the fat with them. Bein sha'asu v'yasa acharein, whether they did it and then he did it after them. Meaning bazeh achar zeh, this one after this one. First the bezdin did it and then he did it. Bein shalo asu bezdin, or let's say bezdin didn't act upon the ruling. V'yasa hayachid al pian, but the individual did act according to what they said. So in all of those cases, since what he's doing is based on the ruling of the Bezdin, Potter, he's exempt. What is he exempt from? Milohavi kisba o seira. He's exempt from bringing a carbon, which is either a kisba, which is a sheep, or seira, which is a goat. Hoel v'tala bebezdin v'yasal piyam. Since what he was doing was based on the ruling of the court, he doesn't have to bring that carbon. Horu Bezdin v'yada echad mehem mi Bezdin shato. Now let's say Bezdin issued the ruling, and one of the individuals on the court understands that what they said was a mistake. O Talmud roi lahora, or let's say there was a student who was able to issue rulings himself. V'halach oso echad, and that individual, also Talmud, or that student, went ahead v'yasa al piyam and did and acted based upon their ruling. Shato b'mitzvah l'shmoa divrei chachamim, that he made a mistake in terms of the commandment to listen to the words of the chachamim. Kidim mefarish b'gemara, as the Gemara will explain. Hareza chayiv, so in that case he is obligated because what he did wasn't really dependent on Bezdin. Because he knew that they made a mistake. And we say in the Gemara, if he does it on his own, then he's obligated, but if he does it based on the ruling of the Bezdin, then he's potter, he is exempt. And the Gemara says, Amar Shmuel says, Liolam ein Bezdin chayav, and Bezdin is not obligated, ad sheyomru lahem, until they say to them, mutarim atem, that it's mutter, that you can do this, it's permitted for you. Rav Dimi min Hardoy, Amar Rav Dimi from Hardoy, he says, ad sheyomru lahem mutarin atem, they have to say to them, it is permitted for you, lasos, to do it. They have to add in the word lasos, and then we say that it's a real ruling of the court. And the Gemara says, my timer, what's the reason for this? Meaning, what's the reason, according to Rav Dimi, that they need to say lasos, lefishalo nigmar hara, because if they don't say lasos, if they don't say it is mutter for you, it is permitted for you to do it, so then the ruling is not considered to be conclusive. And Rashi explains, liolam ein bezin chayav, and bezin is not obligated. Kiyasu hakol orubo al pihem. This is talking about, let's say the congregation or the majority acts in accordance with their ruling. Kilomar means to say, Bein Laman Damar Bezdin Mevi'in Par, whether we're following the opinion that says that it's the court that has to bring the carbon of a par, of a bull, Bein Laman Damar Tzibur Mevi'in Par, whether it's according to the one who says that it is the community that has to bring the bull, Velo Bezdin, and not the court. But regardless, Liolam lo have a Gemar Hora. The point over here is, it's not considered to be a conclusive ruling, the Lachayev carbon, that carbon should be obligated, and then with regards to, let's say, an individual follows the court, where he then does not have to bring a carbon because he can say that he was relying on Bezdin, but it's not really considered to be a Gemar Hora, a conclusive ruling of the court, ad she'omru Bezdin l'tzibor mutar natem, until Bezdin says to the community, it is permitted for you. Rav Dimi Amar, Rav Dimi says, Liolam lo nigmar hora l'chayev on carbon, it's not considered a concluded ruling that there's an obligation to bring a carbon, ad she'yomru mutaran atem lasos, until they say it's permitted for you to do. They have to say lasos as well. That's the machlokus between Shmuel and Rav Dimi min Ahardoi. And the Gemara continues, Amar Abaya, Abaya says, Afan non nami tanina, we learn the same thing in a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in Sanhedrin. Chazar le'iro, if the person returned to his city, Shana v'limed kederech shalimed, and if he goes and teaches the way he taught, Pater, he is exempt. Horelasos, but if he issues the ruling to do, so then chayiv, then he is obligated. And Rashi explains, Zafanon nami tanina beperak Elohein hanechenokin. This is a Mishnah in Perak Elohein hanechenokin, which is in Sanhedrin. The case over here, says Rashi, is Chazar Zokin Mamre Le'iro. This is talking about a Zokin Mamre, a rebellious elder. He returns to his city, and so he's rebelling against the ruling of the court. Hora lasos, and so what does it say in this Mishnah? It says that if he returns to a city and he teaches in the same way, he continues to rebel. So if he just teaches, he's exempt. But if it's hora lasos, as Rashi says, hora lasos demashma dekamar mutarn atem lasos, if he issues the ruling to do, that implies that what he said was it's permitted for you to do. The nigmara hora also, that his hora, his ruling has been conclusive. So then chayiv, so then he's chayiv. And so you see, Abai is bringing this Mishnah. You see, like Rav Dimi min Ahardoi, that it's considered nigmar hora only when you say mutar matem lasos. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Abba says, Afanon nami tanina, we also learn this in a Mishnah, this is a Mishnah in Yavamis. Horula Bezdin lihinase, let's say the Bezdin issued a ruling for her that she's allowed to get married. This is talking about a situation where a woman has to determine, a wife has to determine whether her husband has died and that she's able to remarry. If they issue that ruling, v'holcha v'kilkala, but then she goes ahead and instead of remarrying, instead of marrying someone else, she commits an act of znus, so chayeves b'karban, so she's obligated to bring a carbon. Shelo hitiru lo ela lihinase, because the only thing that they gave her permission for was to get married. They didn't give her permission for znus. Rashi explains, Horu law bezdin lihinase, if the bezdin issues a ruling to allow her to remarry, al pi eid echad, let's say it's with one witness, the ibishnei edim lo tzarich bezdin. If there are two witnesses, you don't even need the court. So the court here is issuing a ruling because there was just one witness. V'halcha v'kilkala biznus, but then she goes ahead and commits an act of znus. V'achar kach babala, and then her husband returns. That's the case. So chayeves bekarban, then she has to bring a carbon lefi shelo haisa tola bebezdin, because this is not considered a case that she can say that she was relying on bezdin. And the point over here is, midakatani horula bezdin lehinase, since the language of the Mishnah is that the bezdin issued a ruling for her to get married, velo katani doesn't simply say hitirua bezdin, that the bezdin permitted her, shma mina delo nigmar horasam at sheyomru mutar natem lasso. So you see that it's not considered a conclusive ruling until they phrase it as mutar matem lassos, it's permitted for you to do. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravina says, Afanon nami tanina, we learn the same thing in our Mishnah up above. Horu bezdin lavor alachas mikol mitzvahs v'amuros b'torah. The language of our Mishnah was that bezdin issued a ruling to transgress one of the mitzvahs in the Torah. And Rashi explains, Horu bezdin lavor demashma horu bezdin lasos. If you're using the language of horu bezdin lavor, that sounds like they issued a ruling to do. De'ena gemura horasam, it's not a conclusive ruling. At sheyomru mutarin atem lasos, until they say mutarim atem lasos. And the Gemara says, sulo midi. Once we have this proof from our Mishnah, nothing further needs to be said. And the Gemara continues, Ika di Amri, there are those that say, and this will be a slightly different version of the above discussion, Amar Shmuel, Shmuel says, Ein Bezdin chayovin at sheyomru lahem mutarim atem lasos. Bezdin is not chayiv until they say to them, mutarim atem lasos, that it's permitted for you to do it. Rav Dimi min Hardoi, Amar Rav Dimi from Hardoi says, Afilu mutarim atem, even if they just say it's mutar for you, nigmar hora, the ruling is considered to be conclusive. And the point over here is that we're reversing the opinions of Shmuel and Rav Dimi. In this second version, according to Shmuel, they have to say lasos in order for it to be considered nigmar horason. And Rav Dimi min Hardoi says the opposite, just mutarim atem is enough. And so over here, everything will be reversed. Amar Abaye, Abaye says, v'halo tanan hachi. But the Mishnah does not seem like Rav Dimi. Here, all of these proofs are going to be against Rav Dimi instead of in support of Rav Dimi. And again, bringing the same Mishnayos as above, Chazar le'iro, if he returns to a city by the Zakin Mamre, Veshana, and he teaches Olimed, Veshana Olimed, Kederach Shalimed, and he continues to teach the way he was ruling, the way he was teaching, Potter, then he's exempt. Hora lasos chayiv, but if he issues the ruling to do, so then he's chayiv. You see that it has to be lasos. Rabbi Abba says, v'halo tanan hachi. Again, we didn't learn like this in a Mishnah. And this is, again, the Mishnah in Yevamos. Hora la bezdin lehinase. If the bezdin issues a ruling for her to remarry, v'holcha v'kilkula, and she goes ahead and she commits an act of znus, chayeves b'karban, she's obligated to bring a carbon, shlo itiru la elo lehinase. They only permitted her to get married. Amar Ravina says, v'halo tanan hachi. We didn't learn like this in our Mishnah. Horu bezdin lavor alachas mikol mitzvos hamuras b'Torah. The bezdin issued a ruling to transgress one of the mitzvahs in the Torah, and again, sulo midi, nothing further needs to be said. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "V'halach hayochid v'yasa shogeg al piyam." It said an individual went ahead and he acted in accordance with their ruling, and the Mishnah uses the word shogeg. He did this by mistake. And so the Gemara asks, V'nisni v'asa al piyam. Why does the Mishnah simply say he acted in accordance with their ruling? Shogeg lamali. What is the word shogeg adding? Why does it need to say that he did this by mistake? It doesn't even really make sense to say the word shogeg. And the Gemara says, Amar Rava. Rava says, shogeg, the word shogeg over here, he did it by mistake. La'asuye, that comes to include the following case. Horu bezdin shechelev mutter. Let's say, for example, bezdin issued a ruling that chelev is mutter. V'nischalev lo chelev b'shuman, and then he mixed up chelev with shuman. Shuman is the kosher kind of fat. Again, chelev is the non-kosher. V'achlo, and so he ate chelev. So what essentially happened over here was he didn't eat the chelev because of their ruling. He ate it because he mixed up the chelev and the shuman. So then we say pater. Then we say that he is exempt in that case. Al pihem mamish. Because when it says al pihem, it means mamish al pihem. And Rashi explains, Amar Rava says, Tarti Katani, the way to understand the Mishnah is it's two separate ideas. Demash Mahachi, it should be understood as follows. V'halach hayachid v'asa o shogeg o al piyem. The individual goes ahead and he acts either mistakenly or he acts in according with their words and according with their ruling. Shogeg, and so the way to understand these two ideas is as follows. Shogeg means, Kagon shahoru bezdin shechelev mutter. Again, bezdin issued a ruling that chelev is mutter, is permitted, and that was a mistaken ruling. V'nischalef lo chelev b'shuman. But then, he mixed up chelev and shuman, v'yachlo, and he ate the chelev by mistake, to potter, so in that case he is exempt. Now the chiddush over there is, afagav de lo have al piyam mamish. Now even though he wasn't really eating the chelev because of their ruling, he actually ate it without intention. Nevertheless, since had he known this was chaylev, lo have a hadr be, he would not have changed what he did. Because Bezin already issued a ruling that chaylev was permitted. That's considered tola bebezin, and he's exempt. Meaning to say, even though he didn't act in accordance with, he didn't act because of what Bezin said, since in theory he would have still eaten the chaylev had he known it was chaylev, because Bezdin had said it was permitted, that's considered acting because of Bezdin, and therefore he would be exempt from a carbon in that case. And Rashi continues, Al Piyah Mamish, if it's actually based on their ruling, Kagon Shahoru Bezin Shechelev Mutter, that would be, for example, when Bezin issues a ruling that Chelev is permitted, V'halach V'yas Al Piyam, and then he just goes ahead and acts according to their ruling. That would be the second scenario, that's Al Piyam. That simply means Al Piyah Mamish, he actually does it based on their ruling. And the whole point of this understanding is, Lashmin, and this would teach us, to Shogeg Al Piyam Putter, that even if it's Shogeg, even if it's a mistake Al Piyam, meaning to say he did it by mistake, but he would have done it had he not been mistaken, he would have done it anyway because of their ruling, he's exempt in that case as well. And the Gemara continues, V'ika di'amri, there are those that say this is going to be the opposite version of Rava. Amar Rava, that Rava says, Shogeg al piem hu de pater, he's only exempt if it's Shogeg al piem, meaning to say that he's doing it based on their ruling. Avol nischalif lo chayla b'shuman, but if he mixes up chayla and shuman, va'achlo, and he eats it, chayev, he actually would be obligated, because in that case, he wasn't really acting according to that ruling. And Milsa de Pshita le Rava, and then the Gemara says, what was obvious to Rava, Kami boy le Rami Bar Chama. That's actually a question according to Rami Bar Chama. The boy Rami Bar Chama, because Rami Bar Chama asked this as a question. Horu bezin shechelav mutter, if the bezdin issued a ruling that chelav is mutter, v'nischalif lo b'shuman, and then chelav gets mixed up with shuman, v'achlo, and he eats it, mahu, what is the halacha? Rami Bar Chama had a question about this very case. And Rashi explains, the Isde Amri, there are those that say, again, this is the second version of Rava, where Rava is saying he is only patur in a case where it's al pihem, not in a case of shogeg. Chada katani, it's all one case. Lahachi itzrich lemisni shogeg al pihem. The reason why it uses the word shogeg in the Mishnah and says shogeg al pihem, demashma de v'shogeg mamish al pihem hu de patur, dehainu al pihem mamish. That just means that it has to actually have been al pihem. That's what's being called shogeg mamish al pihem. He acted because of their ruling. The Yoda de Chaylav Upater, that he knew that it was Chaylav, and he is Pater Misham Detala Bebezdin Mamish, because of the fact that he was completely doing it based on the ruling of the court. Avol Shogeg Shalo Alpien. But let's say it's a situation where it was a mistake, and it really wasn't because of their ruling. Again, Kagon Shoru Bezin Shechaylav Mutter. For example, Bezin issued a ruling that Chaylav is Mutter, v'neschalaf lo Chaylav b'shuman, and he mixed up Chaylav and Shuman, v'yachlo, and he ate it. Chayiv, then he would be Chayiv, Shalo Tala Atzmo Bebezin, because there he wasn't really relying on the court. It was because he got the Chaylav and the Shuman mixed up. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava, Rava says, Tashma, come and hear the following proof from our Mishnah to this question, again, of Rami Bar Chama, what would happen in a situation where he mixed up Chaylav and Shuman. The language of our Mishnah was, Halach Yochid V'yasa Shogeg Al Piem. Again, it's Shogeg Al Piem. He acts according to what they said, but it has the word Shogeg there. Shogeg Al Piem. Lamali, what do you have to have the phrase Shogeg Al Piem? La'av La'suye, isn't that coming to include Horu Bezin Shechaylav Mutter, V'neschalev Lo Chaylav B'Shuman, V'yachlo Pater. It's including this exact case. Bezin issued a ruling that Chaylav is permitted, he mixed up Chaylav and Shuman and he ate it, that he would be Pater. The Gemara says, not necessarily, Dilma Shogeg Al Piem hu de Pater, maybe it's only if he acts according to their ruling that he's Pater, Avol Nischalef Lo Chaylav B'Shuman, V'yach Lo Chayiv, but if he mixes up Chaylav and Shuman and eats it, then maybe he would be Chayiv. The Gemara continues, Ika Diamri, there are those that say another version of this proof. Amar Rava, Rava says, Tashma, come and hear a proof from our Mishnah. Halach Yochid V'yasa Shogeg Al Piem, again it uses the phrase Shogeg Al Piem. My lav Shogeg Al Piem hu de Pater, Avol Nischalef Lo Chaylav B'Shuman, V'yach Lo Chayiv. Doesn't it mean that it has to be Al Piem, has to be based on their ruling, but if he mixed up Chaylav and Shuman and he eats it, he's Chayiv. And the Gemara says again, not necessarily, Dilma o Shogeg o Al Piem. Maybe it just means either Shogeg or Al Piem. And the Gemara continues, but Pluksa, this is actually a machlokas, it's actually an argument amongst Amoraim, as follows on this issue. Horu Bezin Shechaylav Mutter, again, Bezin issued a ruling that Chaylav is permitted, V'nischalef lo Chaylav b'Shuman, and Chaylav got mixed up with Shuman, V'yachlo, and he eats it. Rav Amar Pater, V'Rab Yochanan Amar Chayev. Rav says Pater, and Rab Yochanan says Chayev. We have a machlokas Amoraim on this case. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question from the following Brisa. This will be a question on Rabbi Yochanan. Again, Rabbi Yochanan says in a situation where the person mixed up Chaylav and Shuman, he's obligated to bring a carbon because that's not considered acting based on the ruling of the Bezdin. The Pasuk says by carbon Chatas, Me'am ha'aretz ba'asos. It says from among the people when he commits the Aveira. We'll see the full Pasuk. The Pasuk says, Vim nefesh achas techeta b'shkaga. If an individual sins by mistake, Me'am ha'aretz ba'asos achas mi mitzvos Hashem. From among the people, he does one of the mitzvahs asher lo seyasena, which he's not supposed to do. V'yashem, and is guilty. Ahoda ilav chatasu, he becomes aware of his sin. Asher chata vehevi karbano, he becomes aware of his sin that he sinned, and he brings his carbon. And so the language of the pasuk is from among the people, as if not all of the people. And so the Brisa says prat l'mumar, that comes to exclude a mumar. And the Meseches Hashas notes, as the Meseches Hashas said in Meseches Avodah Zarah as well, the word mumar is generally really should be mishumad. It means an apostate, somebody who renounces the mitzvos. And so we're excluding a mishumad because he already has renounced the mitzvos. That's not somebody who's going to bring a carbon chatas because it was a mistake. Rabbi Shimon ben Yosi Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yosi says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, Harehu Omer, the pasuk says asher lo se'asena b'shgaga v'ashem ohoda. It says that he becomes aware of his sin, and that means hashav miyadiyaso, somebody who would return based on his knowledge, he would repent. Maybe carbon al shigagaso. Such a person brings a carbon when he does it by mistake. But lo shav miyadiyaso. But if he's not going to repent because of his knowledge, because he finds out about his sin, eino maybe carbon al shigagaso. He doesn't bring a carbon on his shogeg. He doesn't bring a carbon on his mistake. And so the Gemara says, based on this brisa, via misa, now if it's true what Rabbi Yochanan says, that a person who just simply mixed up chaylev and shuman is obligated, halo shav miyadiyaso, but this is not included in a shav miyadiyaso, because here the Bezdin issued this mistaken ruling. So even if he found out that he had mixed up the chaylev and shuman, he would still commit the avera, because he thinks the Bezdin said that that is permitted. And so therefore that seems to be a question on Rabbi Yochanan. Why does Rabbi Yochanan say that in such a situation he's chayiv to bring a carbon? And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Papa says, Kasav Rabbi Yochanan holds, Kevan dechi mesiyad lehu lebeidina hadri behu. Since in this particular case, if the Bezdin became aware that it was a mistaken ruling, they would retract. V'hu nami hadr bei, and then he also would retract. So shav miyadiyaso karinan bei, that actually is called shav miyadiyaso. That is called somebody who would repent when he finds out, v'chayev, and that's why he's obligated to bring a carbon. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Moda Rav would admit, She'eno mashlim l'rov tzibor, that this individual, let's say this individual who mixes up the chaylev and the shuman, so he will not complete a majority of the community. Meaning to say, there's a halach again, that if the majority, if the rov tzibor, if they commit this avera based on the ruling of the Bezdin, so then you have a situation of what's called a par helam davar shal tzibor, but it has to be the majority of the community in order for there to be an obligation to bring this carbon. But in this situation, let's say this particular individual who did it because he mixed up the chaylev and the shuman, even though Rav says that in such a situation he is exempt, it's considered that he's acting based on the Bezdin's ruling, but his action is not going to be included in the calculation to determine if this was rov tzibor that did this, if this was the majority. And what's the reason for that? My timer, what's the reason? Amar Kratz, because the pasuk says bishgaga, it says by mistake, achiu kulan bishgaga achas, they all have to have made the same mistake. And over here, this person, he didn't simply act in accordance with the court like everybody else, he actually mixed up chaylev and shuman, so he doesn't count among their number. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Bein sha'asu v'yaso imoyin, whether they did it and he did it with them. And the Mishnah goes through various scenarios, and the Gemara says, Lamalei lemisne kolhani, what's the point of teaching all of these various scenarios? They did it and he did it together with them, he did it after them. And the Gemara says, Bishlama Reisha, now I understand in the beginning, Lozu afzu katani, the Mishnah is structured as not only this, but even this. Eloseva de l'chiyuva, but at the end of the Mishnah, where it's talking about obligation, ipchami boile, it actually should be reversed. And Rashi explains, Lamali lemisni kula, why do we have to teach all these various scenarios? B'masniz in our Mishnah, v'yasa imaim, he does it with them, v'yasa achareim, he does it after them, shalo asu v'asa, they don't do it and he does do it. Now, Bishlama Reisha lozu afsu katani, I understand the beginning of the Mishnah, it's a lozu afsu, meaning, Dahachi mashmatz, to be understood as follows, Lo mi boy zu da'asa imohem. We don't have to even tell you a case where he does it with them, to have a vaday tola bebezin. There he's certainly doing it based on the courts, to potter, so he's exempt. Ela'af zu nami dasa achareim, even if he did it after them, have a tola bebezin u potter. That's also dependent on the court, and he's exempt. V'lo zu bilvad, not only that, dasa achareim potter, where he does it after them potter. Ela'af zu delo asu bezin v'yasa, even if they didn't even do anything and he did it. Afilu achi tola bebezin havu potter. Nevertheless, that's considered dependent upon the courts and potter. Elaseifa ibchami boile lemisna, but at the end of the Mishnah, there it should have been in the reverse. The hachi boile lemisna, it should have actually said that the following: Horu Bezdin, if the Bezdin issued a ruling, v'yada echad mehen shato, and one of them knows that it was a mistake, o Talmud v'roi lahora, a student knows it was a mistake, v'alach v'yasa al piyam, and he does what they said, bein shalo asu v'yasa, so it should have been reversed. Whether they didn't do it and he did it, ubein sha'asa achareim, whether he did it after, ubein sha'asa imam, or even if he did it with them, the lo tala bebezdin, where it wasn't dependent on the court, to have a mashma lo zu bilvad, because then it would make sense. It would be understood as not only here, to lo asu v'yasa, in a case where they didn't do it and he did it, to lo have a tola bebezdin, where that's not considered tola bebezdin, the chayiv that he's obligated, ela avzu da'asa achareim, even if he did it after them, lo tala bebezdin, that's also not considered dependent upon the court, v'chayiv, and he's obligated, v'lo zu bilvad, and not only that, not only if he did it after them, chayiv, that he's obligated, even if he did it with them, we say he's obligated. Because one might have thought, that if he's doing it with them already, that's already doing it based on the court. He should be potter. Nevertheless, we say, since he knows that they made a mistake, that's not considered doing it based on the court, and he is chayiv, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Beis Amid Beis.